The entire auction room went silent the moment the violin case was opened, not because of excitement, because of pity. A few of the senior appraisers exchanged glances without saying a word. One of them, a man in a pressed linen blazer who had authenticated instruments for 3 decades, leaned in, studied the cracked body and collapsed bridge for exactly 11 seconds, then straightened up and said what everyone in the room was already thinking. "This instrument is beyond saving. I'm sorry. There's nothing left to restore here." Standing near the back of the room in a gray wool blazer that still had a faint coffee stain on the left cuff, Serena Whitfield heard every word. She didn't argue, she didn't cry. She simply looked down at the broken violin inside its worn velvet case, and pressed her lips together in the way people do when they're trying very hard not to fall apart in a room full of strangers. Then, from a workbench in the corner, a man with sawdust on his forearms and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, quietly said, "May I take a look at it first?" Nobody laughed out loud, but a few people smiled in that particular way that means the same thing. Nobody in that room understood that what they were about to witness wasn't going to be a failure. It was going to be the moment one man's invisible life finally became impossible to ignore. If you've ever been told that something you loved was too broken to be worth saving, stay with this story. And if it means something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Clifton Beale had spent most of his adult life working with his hands, in ways that never made him famous. At 43, he ran a one-man instrument repair shop out of a converted garage in Asheville, North Carolina. The kind of place most people drove past without noticing, with a hand-painted sign above the door, and a rusted metal bench out front, where customers sometimes sat waiting while he finished a job inside. He repaired violins, cellos, the occasional upright bass. He fixed cracks in spruce tops and reset loose necks and replaced worn-out tuning pegs, with the patience of someone who had long ago made peace with slow, invisible work. He was not famous, he was not connected. He was not the kind of man whose name appeared on the programs of concert halls, or in the catalogs of prestigious instrument dealers. He was simply the person musicians called when no one else could help them. His daughter Emma was 11 years old. She slept in a room with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling that Clifton had stuck up there the year her mother died, and never taken down because Emma asked him not to. She did her homework at the kitchen table while Clifton worked in the garage with the connecting door propped open between them. Some evenings she brought her own small notebook in and sat on an overturned crate beside his workbench, drawing pictures while old jazz records played softly from a paint-splattered radio. Those hours, quiet, unhurried, just the two of them, were the truest thing left in his life. Clifton's wife, Rachel, had died 4 years earlier, an aggressive cancer that moved faster than anyone had prepared for. What followed was the kind of collapse that doesn't announce itself all at once. It arrives in pieces. First the hospital bills which consumed the savings they'd spent 8 years building, then the bank's decision to foreclose on the small workshop he'd rented downtown. After 3 months of missed payments, while he sat beside Rachel in hospice. Then the gradual withdrawal of the small roster of professional musicians who had trusted him with their instruments, not out of cruelty, but because word spread quietly that Clifton wasn't taking on new work, and by the time he was ready to work again, many of them had found someone else. He rebuilt slowly, moved the shop into the garage, lowered his prices, took on jobs others turned down, badly damaged instruments, forgotten family heirlooms, student violins that had been repaired badly once and needed everything undone and redone properly. He didn't complain about any of it, he simply worked. What most people didn't know, because Clifton had never been the kind of man to talk about himself in rooms full of other people, was that before Rachel's illness, he had spent nearly a decade doing something far more specialized. He had studied under a luthier named Arthur Brennan, a craftsman now in his 80s, who had trained in the German workshops of the 1970s, and was considered one of the few living experts in the acoustic architecture of pre-war Italian stringed instruments. Clifton had spent years learning how those instruments were built, not just structurally, but philosophically, how the wood was chosen, how the curves were calculated, how each maker's particular vision of sound was embedded into the physical shape of the instrument itself. He understood things about the relationship between material and music that most repair technicians never learned. Because most repair technicians were never taught the way Arthur had taught him. That knowledge lived quietly inside him now, mostly unused, like a language he spoke fluently in a country where no one else knew the words. Serena Whitfield was 47 years old and ran the largest independent classical music foundation in the American Southeast. The Whitfield Foundation funded emerging musicians, sponsored concert series in mid-sized cities, and maintained what was considered one of the most respected private collections of historical instruments in the country. Instruments that were loaned to professional musicians for performance, housed carefully, and treated as living artifacts rather than display pieces. Serena had inherited the foundation from her mother, Dorothea Whitfield, who had built it over 30 years, with the focused devotion of someone who believed deeply that music was not a luxury, but a form of oxygen. Dorothea had died 2 winters ago, and with her death, Serena had become the sole guardian of everything her mother had built, including the violin. The violin had no official name, but within the foundation it was simply called the Ashworth, after the small town in Virginia, where Dorothea had found it at a private estate sale in 1987. It was a late 18th century instrument, of uncertain but significant provenance. Possibly Italian, possibly German, with construction details that suggested the work of a master who had trained in more than one tradition. Dorothea had never allowed it to be auctioned or sold. She had it restored carefully once, in the early 90s, and then kept it in archival conditions, bringing it out only for special occasions, and only for musicians she trusted her personally. She called it the clearest proof she had that something made with love could outlast everything else. When the transport company's climate-controlled van was rear-ended on I-26 during a rainstorm last October, the Ashworth was inside. The case survived. The violin did not. The damage was severe. The top had cracked in 2 places along the grain. The neck block had shifted dramatically. The bass bar, the small internal wooden strut that bears the tension of the strings and carries vibration through the body of the instrument, had collapsed entirely. Several of the internal bracings had torn free from the plates. The varnish along the upper bout had fractured in a pattern that made the wood beneath look almost wound. When Serena brought it to 3 of the most prominent instrument restoration specialists in the country, all 3 said the same thing in different ways. The structural damage was too extensive. The bass bar replacement alone would require opening the top, and the top was too compromised to survive that process without further cracking. Even if the physical repairs could somehow be completed, the acoustic integrity of the instrument, the particular resonance that had made it exceptional, would almost certainly be lost. Better to keep it as an artifact, a memory, not a violin. Serena had listened to all of this professionally and calmly, and then gone home and sat alone in her mother's old office for a long time. Because the Ashworth was not simply a valuable instrument, it was the last tangible object that still held, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, the feeling of her mother's presence. Dorothea had held that violin, had talked about it with reverence, had made a point, in the last months of her life, of telling Serena that she hoped it would still be played, long after both of them were gone. Letting it become an artifact felt like letting her mother become one too. A colleague suggested she try one more option before accepting the verdict. A small shop in Asheville. The owner was not famous, the colleague admitted, but he had done things with damaged instruments that more decorated craftsmen had refused to attempt. And he had never once been wrong about what could and couldn't be saved. Clifton was replacing tuning pegs on a student cello when Serena Whitfield walked into the garage. She had called ahead, but barely. She arrived 40 minutes after the call, which in Clifton's experience meant someone who had been driving around building courage for a while, before deciding to come in. He recognized that kind of arrival, he'd had it himself. She set the case on his workbench and opened it without saying much. Clifton put down his tools and looked at the violin for a long time without touching it. He circled the bench once, leaned in close to the upper bout crack without using a loop, looked at the neck angle from the side. Then he picked it up very gently, held it toward the light from the open garage door, and turned it slowly. "Who told you it wasn't fixable?" he asked. Serena named the 3 specialists. Clifton knew 2 of them by reputation. Both were excellent craftsmen. Both had also, in his experience, developed the particular caution of people who had spent long enough being right that they had stopped being curious. He set the violin back down. The top can be stabilized before you open it. There's a way to introduce a consolidant along the crack lines that will buy you enough structural integrity to work inside without the top failing. It takes about 2 weeks and it's not exciting to watch, but it works. Serena looked at him carefully. The specialist said the base bar replacement alone. The specialists were worried about the top. I'm not, or at least not in the way they were. He paused. The neck block shift looks worse than it is from outside. The geometry is recoverable. It'll take a long time, and I won't promise you the acoustic result until I'm inside the instrument. But I can tell you right now that this violin is not finished. How do you know that? Clifton was quiet for a moment. He looked at the instrument again. Because I've seen this kind of construction before. The internal bracing pattern is unusual. It's a hybrid approach, Italian outline, with modified German internal geometry. Whoever built this understood something specific about how the plates interact with the bar under tension. That's not common, and if I'm right about what I'm seeing, the way this instrument was originally designed actually works in our favor now. The damage is severe, but the underlying architecture is unusually forgiving. Serena didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask how you know that kind of thing? The hybrid construction. How do you recognize it?" Clifton thought about Arthur Brennan, about the workshop in the mountains outside Schwarzwald, where Arthur had trained, and the years they had spent together going through photographs of opened instruments, studying the way different building traditions approached the same acoustic problem from opposite directions. About the notebook Arthur had given him, filled with annotated diagrams, that Clifton still kept in a drawer beneath his workbench. "I had a good teacher," he said. "The restoration took 4 months. Emma turned 12 during the process, and Clifton baked her a lemon cake and let her stay up past midnight, watching a movie she'd been asking about for weeks. He worked on the Ashworth every morning, before she woke up, and every evening after she went to sleep, and on weekend afternoons while she read on the couch. The garage was warm in October, and cold in November, and Clifton worked through both with the same unhurried focus, because there was no other way to do this kind of work. He stabilized the top first, as he had described, introducing a carefully selected consolidant along both crack lines and letting it cure fully before proceeding. It took 16 days. Nothing visible happened during those 16 days. If you had looked in through the garage window, you would have seen a man sitting quietly at a workbench with a violin. He wasn't and you might have thought nothing was happening at all. But Clifton was watching, measuring, checking the crack lines every morning, with a loop and a small light, waiting for the wood to stop moving. When it was stable, he opened the top. What he found inside confirmed what he had suspected from the beginning. The construction was extraordinary. A level of internal refinement that he had only seen in instruments of genuine historical significance. The bracing pattern was precise and idiosyncratic in equal measure, and it told him something very specific about how the maker had understood the problem of acoustic resonance. The damage, for all its severity, had not destroyed the original intent of the instrument. It had interrupted it. Clifton worked methodically through the interior, cleaning, re-gluing the torn bracings in sequence, fitting and shaping a new bass bar from aged spruce that he had kept in his workshop for years, waiting for a job that warranted it. He reset the neck block over the course of 3 weeks, checking the angle repeatedly against measurements he took from the original geometry before beginning, making adjustments with a patience that most people who knew him would have recognized as the thing most essential to who he was. Serena visited more than she had expected to. She told herself at first that she was simply monitoring the progress of a significant investment. She came once a week, then twice. She brought coffee both times. The second visit she arrived early enough that Emma was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a book. Emma talked to Serena about the book for 6 minutes before going to bed. On the drive home that night, Serena found herself thinking about the quality of that conversation. How Emma had explained the plot, not as a summary but as an argument, with a position and reasons. And feeling something she couldn't quite name, she began staying longer. Not intrusively. Clifton was never one to stop working just because someone was watching, and Serena was not the kind of person who needed to fill silence with conversation. They developed a companionable rhythm. She sat on a stool near the workbench, and read or answered emails while he worked. Sometimes he explained what he was doing, and sometimes he didn't, and she learned to understand the difference between those two modes, not as withholding and sharing, but simply as the difference between moments that required all of his attention and moments that didn't. One evening she arrived at dusk and found Clifton sitting inside the open instrument, not literally, but present with it in the way she had begun to recognize, still and focused, tools set aside, just looking at what he had built. The garage lights were on. Emma was asleep on the old couch in the corner, with a fleece blanket pulled up to her chin, her book face down on the cushion beside her. The scene was so quiet, it felt almost sacred. Serena stood in the doorway for a moment before Clifton heard her. When he looked up, he didn't seem embarrassed to be found like that. He simply said, "She fell asleep about an hour ago. I didn't want to wake her. You could have put her in bed." "She likes it out here," he said. "She always has." He paused. "Rachel used to fall asleep out here too sometimes. Reading, while I worked." He looked at Emma for a moment. "Emma doesn't know she does the same thing. I've never told her." Serena sat down on the second stool, and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "My mother used to fall asleep in her office. I'd find her there when I was young, with papers all over her desk, and the desk lamp still on. I used to turn the lamp off and leave her." A pause. "I'd give a lot to do that one more time." Clifton looked at her, not with sympathy exactly, more with recognition. The particular look of someone who understands what it is to carry a grief that doesn't diminish but does, over years, become quieter. "You're going to have the violin back," he said. "I can't give you your mother back, but the thing she loved most, you'll have that." Serena looked at the half-restored instrument under the workbench light. "I know," she said, "and I think that might be enough." The Ashworth was finished on a Thursday in February. Clifton set it on the workbench in the morning light, and looked at it for a long time before he called Serena. The repairs were invisible. Not because he had hidden the damage. That was not the philosophy he had learned from Arthur. But because he had done the work so precisely that the wood had, in the fullest sense, healed. The top was whole, the neck angle was correct to the fraction of a degree. The new bass bar was fitted and voiced with the kind of attention that meant it was not simply replacing what had been there, but responding to this instrument, this wood, this history. He played a few open strings. Then a scale. Then a phrase he had been turning over in his mind for weeks, something he had heard once from a recording of a violinist whose name he had forgotten. The sound filled the garage. Emma appeared in the doorway from the kitchen, still in her pajamas. She had heard. "Is that it?" she said. "That's it," Clifton said. She walked over and stood beside him and looked at the violin with the serious attention she gave to things that mattered. "It sounds like something important," she said. "It is," he said. Serena brought 3 members of the Foundation's board to the Whitfield Foundation's annual spring gathering. It was a modest event by the standards of the classical music world. Not Carnegie Hall, not a major conservatory. But within the circles that mattered to the Foundation's work, it was significant. Major donors, senior musicians, critics, the directors of several regional orchestras, people who understood what the Ashworth was and what had happened to it. Most of them had heard that Serena had attempted a restoration. None of them had expected success. The word among the more informed attendees was that she had likely salvaged a decorative artifact, something to set in a case and explain with a placard, a monument to a loss, rather than a recovery. When the Foundation's principal violinist walked onto the small stage, and the instrument was handed to her, the room stilled from curiosity more than expectation. She played 4 notes of her tuning, then she stopped. Then she played them again, differently, as if she needed to hear something twice to believe it. Then she looked at Serena, then she played. What happened in the next 8 minutes was the kind of thing that is genuinely difficult to describe to people who weren't present. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was acoustically real. The sound that came from the Ashworth was not the sound of a repaired instrument. It was the sound of an instrument fully, perfectly, entirely itself. Present in the room, with a warmth and clarity and complexity that stopped conversation, and stopped thinking, and simply made everyone listen. When she finished, the silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, then the room erupted. Serena stood near the back, as she always did at these events, and let the moment settle over her. Several people came to find her immediately. A donor who had known Dorothea personally. 2 musicians, who were visibly moved, the foundation's oldest board member, who gripped her hand without speaking for a moment. And then she did something she had been thinking about for the better part of 2 months. She brought Clifton Beale to the front of the room. He stood there looking slightly uncomfortable in the dark sport coat Emma had helped him pick out the previous week, and Serena described, not in the language of press releases but plainly, factually, the way you describe something you actually witnessed. What he had done. Not just the technical achievement of the restoration. Though that was significant enough to be worth describing carefully. But what had made it possible? The years of invisible learning, the relationship with a mentor who had passed on a form of knowledge almost nobody working today still possessed. The patience that could only exist in someone who had been stripped of every reason to hurry and found, in that slowness, something more valuable than speed. She described the garage in Asheville, the coffee stain on her cuff the first time she walked in, the morning she arrived and found Emma asleep on the couch. Several people in the room were crying before she finished. Then she announced what she had already discussed privately with Clifton. The Whitfield Foundation was establishing a new program, a formal apprenticeship and instrument restoration fellowship that would be housed in Asheville and led by Clifton. It would offer funded training to young craftspeople who wanted to work in historical instrument restoration, a field that was genuinely at risk of losing the depth of knowledge it required to survive. The program would be named the Dorothea and Rachel Fellowship, after her mother and after his wife. The room went very still for a moment when she said the names. Clifton, who had been told about the name in advance, and had asked her 3 times over 2 weeks whether she was certain, stood at the front of that room and could not speak for a long time. His jaw was set in the way that meant he was working very hard to hold himself together, and the people watching him understood that, and gave him the time to do it. Emma was in the back of the room, with a borrowed dress, and her hair done for the occasion, and tears running freely down her face, without any apparent effort to stop them, which was, in the judgment of everyone who noticed, entirely appropriate. Later that spring, when the local paper ran a piece about the fellowship, a reporter asked Clifton what he thought had made the difference. Why, he had seen something in the Ashworth that 3 other specialists had missed. He thought about it for a while before answering, which the reporter later noted was characteristic of him. I think, he said finally, that when you've spent time learning from someone who truly loved the thing they were teaching you, you end up seeing more than the damage. You see the original intention underneath it, and once you can see that, once you understand what something was trying to be, it's very hard to give up on it. He paused. That's true of instruments, he said. It's true of it. The reporter asked if he was speaking from experience. Clifton smiled. It was the kind of smile that arrives quietly, from somewhere deep, without any announcement. Ask me in another 4 months, he said. I'll have a better answer. There are people in this world who carry more than anyone can see from the outside, more loss, more knowledge, more patience, more love, and who go about their days in converted garages and unremarkable buildings and small towns most people drive through, without stopping. They are not waiting to be discovered. They are simply doing the work, because the work is what they have, and because some things deserve to be saved regardless of whether anyone is watching. The world does not often stop to look at them. But when it does, what it finds there is never what it expected.